The task force came to be because there was a very statesman-like, public-spirited, retired legislator called Carrington Williams. And Carrington had played a major role when he was in the General Assembly, getting Virginia's ports sorted out. He was conscious that we'd had 3 little ports in the Hampton Roads area all fighting each other, when in reality we needed one strong port competing with New York and Charleston and so on. So he worked and got the Virginia Port Authority created, which took over, I think it was 3 ports down there. And they got a chap called Bobby Bray in to sort of run it and build it up to what we have today. Carrington then retired, came back to his home in Northern Virginia, and at that time, National Airport was a problem because of noise. There was a very well-funded campaign to shut National Airport. The airlines, after deregulation, didn't want to serve Washington through 2 airports. So what service they had at Dulles, domestic service, they moved down to National. And when the domestic service disappeared from Dulles, the feed that it could provide for international flights disappeared. So all the international flights started disappearing. At British Aerospace, which was a maker of airplanes, not an airline, we were worried that BA, British Airways, or Pan Am would move, and then we'd lose our pipeline and have located in the wrong place. Because we located out at Dulles in 1978, and I think we were one of the first major, and certainly the first major foreign company to really locate in Fairfax County / the growing part of it. So we got, it was very much in our interest to get involved with the task force. And we knew how DFW Airport had been boosted after its construction by the North Texas Commission, which had been formed by 6 CEOs down in the Texas-Fort Worth area, and which was a public-private sector partnership. I went down to Texas to refresh my memory, and then we applied all that knowledge to the working side, the non-political side of what became the Washington Airports Task Force. Originally, it was the Washington Dulles Task Force. Later on, about 6 years in, when the Airport Authority was formed to take over the operation of Dulles and National from the federal government, a little group that had been there defending National Airport merged with the Dulles Task Force to form the Washington Airports Task Force. And both groups had been very successful in their objectives. After about 3 years, the task force had persuaded quite a few airlines to start looking seriously at Dulles. Our objectives were very simple. It was to do something about Dulles Airport, and in so doing, relieve the pressures on National and reduce the noise at National. The initial thrust was to get domestic service in. Now, we didn't forget international, but the main thrust was to try and get domestic service in, because international flights, people on them when they leave a US gateway tend to be half local, half connecting from domestic flights. So you don't have the volume you need if you don't have a domestic base. But we knew that in 1980-81, there were over 1 million international travelers a year going out of National Airport, flying largely to New York or to Miami or to the West Coast to make their overseas trip. So there was clear demand for international service at Dulles. There was also clear demand for domestic service. Now, the airlines tended not to be headquartered here, with the exception of what became US Airways and is now American. They were all headquartered somewhere else, and their image of Washington was a sort of likely post-World War II image, whereas federal government, nothing else, and everything round National Airport and nobody wanting to use Dulles. A key that the task force followed was never to promote a service to an airline that we did not believe would be profitable if they did it right. And that is still the rule today, both with the task force and with the Airports Authority. And I think that's a key reason that Dulles has grown, because people put service in and they prospered. What we found, we had awful service to Canada, our biggest trading partner. And when we dug into it, it's because the bilateral agreement that governed the air service between Canada and the United States dated back to the propeller era and was totally archaic. And the negotiators on both sides had grown to hate each other. And so it was totally stalled. And what the task force did was invite 36 Canadian and US cities to meet with us, either their airport people or their economic development people. And we all met down at Crystal City and say, what are we going to do about this? It took 5 years, but we did get the border opened. We took that, it led to the group staying together and saying, okay, let's now push for other things. So we got a cities program started, which allowed a foreign carrier to serve a US city without a bilateral agreement, providing no US carrier was willing to provide the service. So the open skies and getting National Airport reopened, I would tick off from my sojourn at the task force. I mean, there's a lot besides. You can say, well, we got Dulles built into a major international gateway. But it wasn't open, it wouldn't have happened without open skies. A lot of congressmen, in fact a lot of people, felt that if the Europeans were going to build the Concorde and sell it, then the US ought to build its SST. So the opponents of the SST realized they had to sort of destroy the validity of the Concorde in people's mind. So it was inferior, it had technical problems, it wouldn't work, Europeans weren't capable of doing anything like that, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we were totally unprepared for that. It was obvious that if domestic objections could shut down the Alaska pipeline, that there wasn't going to be much sympathy for a foreign SST getting landing rights. I also came to realize that when you've got the power to change this, or your project has the power to change the status quo, there is always massive opposition. But in the end, the politicians ducked, as politicians tend to, and there was a meeting at which it was agreed that the best thing to do was to push the whole matter into the court system. That's for New York, where it ended up. And the Supreme Court ruled that it should have a trial, and it came in, and it didn't even ring the bell on the noise meters, and people were astounded. And I had the great pleasure of being able to tell the national media that we did what we said we would do. Coming in here, the federal government owned Dulles, so said we should have a trial, 18-month trial period. and they built a noise monitoring system in the community and around Dulles, which is the basis of the noise monitoring system which has been used ever since. But we were going to wreck Sully Plantation with vibration. Well, the trial report explained that the vacuum cleaners caused more vibration in the Sully Plantation than the Concorde did. Walter Boyne, who at the time was the director of the National Air and Space Museum, got a hold of me. I was at British Aerospace, and we sat down, had lunch together, and he said, look, we need to expand the Air and Space Museum at Dulles. It's going to take a lot of money. A lot of money is spent by the aerospace industry on the Farnborough and Paris air shows. Any chance we could get them to give those up for a year and give the money to us to expand the museum? And that's where things started. I won't go into the long and the short of the answers, but as a result of that, as by then part of the task force, I put together what we called the Air and Space Heritage Council, but a task force committee which also became a committee of the National Aviation Club and the Aero Club of Washington. The three came together around this committee, and we just had a lively, gregarious group to try and figure out how we could help and push the expansion of the Air and Space Museum. The Smithsonian at that time made it very clear to us, and they made the mistake of saying it in front of John Glenn and a few others, who we'd got to have dinner with the secretary of the Smithsonian, and he got up and said we had to understand that expanding the Air and Space Museum wasn't even on the top 20 priorities of the Smithsonian. About the same time, we were having lunch. The FAA administrator at the time was part of the group, and he was giving us all lunch as we met in his office. And Walter Boyne came in waving a bit of paper from NASA. And the Air and Space Museum have an agreement with NASA that the museum gets first refusal on anything that NASA has finished with. And Walter said they have finished with the Space Shuttle Enterprise, and what they really want to do is put it in their theme park at Cape Kennedy. And I think it was Sandy Murdoch, who was the acting FAA administrator, who said, you tell them you want it. Walter said, well, where am I to put it? How are we to get it here? And Sandy said, you let us worry about that. I'd been asked by the Aero Club to organize the Wright Memorial Dinner that year, never in fact having been to one before in my life. And so we decided, let's do the dinner at Dulles in the Page Hangar, as it then was, and have a handover ceremony of the space shuttle to the Smithsonian as part of that. And let's ask George Bush, then Vice President, to come and hand it over. And we thought we could pull that off, and in fact we did. But it was a close run thing, because they didn't want Houston, Huntsville, Cape Kennedy political teams yanking their budget around over who got the shuttle. So bringing it to the nation's capital was it dodged the bullet. We need to keep the combination of a first-class airports authority supported by the local business and political leadership, i.e. the airlines' core of their repeat business, Secondly, we need to look 10, 20 years ahead at what the airlines are going to need. Airlines tend not to look very far ahead, manufacturers do. And I think we're going to see we're going to see the growth of many more non-stop international flights, probably bypassing a lot of hubs. But the new generation of aircraft have the ability to go from Dulles to about 95% of the world's markets non-stop. To do that, we'll probably need some longer runways. Dulles grew, not BWI, internationally because it was promoted and because it had, for the day, long runways, and BWI couldn't handle the long-range flights, didn't have long enough runways. So I think we need to add at least 1,000 feet to at least one runway. And that can be done, I think, without breaking the noise contours, which I consider a compact between the community and the aviation community and the airport. The second thing I think we need to do is continue with the capital development program at Dulles, and that is easier said than done because of the financial stretch that the airport authority is already under. But we don't have a really first-class international connecting complex at Dulles. It's the old temporary midfield terminal that everybody, when it started, thought would have been disposed of by now. It'll cost probably a couple of $2 billion, and it will be a real challenge. But I think that ultimately is going to be necessary. It's somehow got to be phased in so that it can be built based on revenue growth from increased domestic and international service. And the service is growing again. And lastly, very important, we need to attract the new generation of international lower fare carriers who are making their entry despite massive opposition from the incumbent airlines who don't want the competitive, they're a competitive threat, so they do everything they can to block them through government. But we've got to attract them to Dulles. And that is going to be a challenge because you've already got longer runways now at BWI, which can take transatlantic flights, and you've got a low-fare hub with Southwest. So if you're in Europe, where would you plan to put your low-fare carrier? So I think we've got some real challenges to come, and the key is to position ourselves ahead of where we think the airlines want to be.